Hey watercolor wizards, Hajra here. Since all of my YouTube videos are packed with nerdy goodness and art info, I recently updated them into 15 convenient playlists for all those who are interested. This video is one of my condensed Twitch streams with a voiceover. I did a gouache bird with flowers in my moleskin watercolor journal. I'm going to be discussing just the differences between gouache and watercolor crayon handling in this video, as I got a lot of questions about that during the original live stream for this. So I started with some local staining colors, and then I moved on to thicker layers of gouache and some lifting for highlights or correction. I typically work from thin to thick paint, whether I'm using traditional transparent watercolor or opaque watercolor, also called gouache, or watercolor crayon, which behaves like a water-soluble oil paint and can be used thin like watercolor or thick like gouache. I also use various types of ink products, but I'll be discussing those in other videos. So to reiterate the differences between watercolor and gouache in the painting process, with traditional watercolor, you typically develop pieces in thin layers of color. If you dry these transparent layers in between each other, they're called glazes. It's traditional to save white for watercolor pieces, as you can't do light over dark colors well, making it a subtractive medium. There is limited lifting you can do for highlights and corrections, and edges can be blended with water and a damp brush. Blending and lifting works pretty well if you use a good watercolor paper like Arches. Also, we dilute for gradients and tints in traditional watercolor, rather than using white paint. For both gouache and watercolor crayons, the layering is a bit trickier. You can layer, and indeed totally cover up under layers opaquely, which you cannot do in transparent watercolor. But gouache sits on the surface rather than staining and sinking into the paper, so it'll re-wet more easily than transparent watercolor. This means layers have to be carefully applied with a light hand, and later layers have to use drier, thicker paint, not runny, thin paint. Otherwise, the gouache or watercolor crayon will just lift off and run and make a muddy mess. Obviously, this means we also cannot glaze in gouache. Color key changes have to be applied sectionally and not as an easy all-over color glaze. As you can see for this bird piece, gouache is an additive medium, not subtractive like watercolor. This means I can go light to dark, but also dark to light. I can use white anywhere for highlights and tints, and can also lift the paint easily for highlights or corrections. Gradients are not achieved here via paint dilution, however. They require color strings to be mixed on your palette, though I found you can do some gradient blending right on your paper between wet edges too. Here you can see me do blending between wet edges on the bird or on the leaves between different color values. Tiling is the safest technique for gouache. By applying your color in deliberate, palette-mixed mosaic pieces adjacent to each other, you can reduce layers to only highlights or corrections after the initial tiling layer. The hard edges of the tiles can be left as is for a stylized poster or graphic or marker effect, or blended into soft edges with a damp, almost dry brush, or a brush with more gouache on it, which keeps away pesky blooms. I didn't choose to do a grisaille or value underpainting for this bird, but I have other videos where I show that useful technique. If you do want a grisaille underneath, you can just tile over it if you're using gouache. Don't glaze over it like you would in watercolor, ink, oil, or acrylic. It's just gonna lift and make a mess. Basically, thin watery paint in later layers is a no-no for gouache, but of course you can use thicker paint in later layers. There are also differences between gouache and watercolor crayon, both of which are used in parts here and both look like gouache. True gouache will have a matte and velvety finish. Watercolor crayon will have a waxy, oily handling and a sort of shiny finish from the side. It sort of dries with a waxy resist and can be slippery when layering. It also seems to lift even easier than true gouache because of this waxiness, so you have to apply it in thicker layers as you proceed and also with an even lighter hand. Lastly, Arches watercolor paper is an amazing surface for all these mediums: watercolor, gouache, watercolor crayon, or ink, which I discussed in other videos. However, the pure absorbent cotton fiber and gelatin sizing that Arches boasts for heavy water application, easy blending and lifting, and intense color saturation aren't as important when using gouache or watercolor crayons. Both these two opaque mediums will work about as well on cheaper watercolor paper or even cardstock with no sizing when it comes to blending, because they lift and move around easier than watercolor or ink. And Arches or Arche puts up with a heavy water load and warps less than cheaper paper. But gouache and watercolor crayon use less water than traditional watercolor, so again, they can be paired with a cheaper paper. I tried to answer a lot of the follow-up watercolor versus gouache versus watercolor crayon questions I've been asked, and I hope you learned something and enjoyed seeing this bird take shape. I worked more on the flowers after the stream. Check out my other watercolor versus gouache and solitary watercolor and gouache videos for more information about these mediums. Well, wizards, thanks for parking your brushes here. Please like, comment, subscribe, and check out my website links below. If you're interested in buying my originals or prints, please email me or visit my website for information. As always, wishing you epic painting adventures.